Most nations during the Second World War had fairly standard methods for naming their tank guns. Take the Germans, for example, who had a standard system for all of their domestically produced armaments. Their most famous gun, the Tiger's 88mm, was referred to as the 8.8cm KWK-36 L56, meaning 88mm fighting vehicle gun 36 L56, with each part of the name referring to a specific part of the gun. They are as follows. 8.8cm, or 88mm, is the diameter of the barrel. KWK stands for Kampfwagenkanon, meaning fighting vehicle gun, roughly, showing that this is to be mounted on tanks. The other common designation was PAK for Panzerabwehrkanone, meaning anti-tank gun. PAK guns wouldn't generally be mounted on vehicles, but with some exceptions. The 36 in the name refers to the year the original gun was developed, 1936 in this case. And finally, L56 is the length to caliber ratio, so the length of the barrel is 8.8cm multiplied by 56, giving a length of around 4.9 meters, which is how long the barrel is. That was a rather long tangent, but I hope you now have an appreciation for how ordered their names were. When that's compared to the archaic British system, which has guns such as the 32-pounder QF 95mm and 3-inch howitzer, it could probably be quite hard to work out what all the British guns are when you're reading about them. I've collected all of the guns commonly mounted to tanks in the war so I can give a simple definition for each one. As there are many available to choose from, I'll just list some of the more common ones now and make a part 2 to this video in the future at some point. The first is the OQF Vickers 3-pounder, which has a diameter of 47mm. OQF stands for Ordnance Quick Firing, with quick firing meaning that the shell and the charge is all in one load, so only one thing needs to be loaded into the gun as opposed to many. The 47mm caliber shows up on other vehicles of the war, especially at the start, such as the Shah B1 and S-35 tanks, or the Czech gun fitted to the Panzerjäger 1. It was first used in 1924 and was fitted to a variety of interwar tanks, such as the A1E1 Independent or the Vickers Mark E, among others. The barrel was either 31 or 40 calibers long, 1.5 or 1.9 meters, and when built it had a requirement to penetrate the armour of enemy tanks at just under a kilometre. As tanks of that time generally had much thinner armour, this low velocity gun was pretty ineffective against most vehicles during the Second World War. So just before it started, it was replaced by the 2-pounder. I've included it in this list as some of the guns were used though, because a gun is still a gun even though it's obsolete. Its replacement, the OQF 2-pounder, was a 40mm weapon and probably the most common British gun of the war. It was fitted to pretty much every tank the British fielded, at least at some point, especially early in the war, including Matilda, Valentine, Churchill, Crusader, Cromwell, early cruiser tanks, among many more. A lot of these vehicles were later upgraded with a more powerful gun, as the 2-pounder became fairly obsolete after 1941, 1942, that sort of time. At this point, the armour of most German tanks was too thick for the gun to deal with, so stronger guns were required, but the weaker Japanese tanks were still vulnerable. One severe deficit with the 2-pounder was the fact that it was only equipped with a high explosive shell in 1942, meaning tanks had to rely on their machine guns for dealing with soft targets before this came along. It served later in the war on armoured cars, and a squeeze bore adapter was developed to slightly increase its armour-piercing performance. However, the armour of tanks continued to increase and made it pretty ineffective. Its replacement was the OQF 6-pounder, which came into service in early 1942. It was heavily delayed into coming into service by the fact that the need for 2-pounders was so great around the Battle of Britain and the time that everyone was scared that the Germans would invade, that it was decided that their production would not stop, as the time taken to retool and retrain gun crews would have been too great, and as many guns as possible were needed for the defence of the British Isles. The 6-pounder was a 57mm gun and was a huge step up from the 2-pounder. When the British troops first met the Tiger in North Africa and later the Panther in Italy, it was 6-pounder guns that knocked them out. It was used for around 20 years after the war in British service, and it is in use in limited quantities today. It was also adopted by the Americans as the 57mm gun M1 and was used widely by them. Overall, it was incredibly successful, and whilst an 8-pounder was planned to replace it, the 6-pounder proved superior still. Following the 6-pounder into production was the famed OQF 17-pounder, as mounted on tanks such as the Sherman Firefly or the Challenger. This had a barrel diameter of 76.2mm and was possibly the most powerful anti-tank gun of the Western Allies, significantly outclassing the American 76mm gun in terms of destructive power. However, it was slightly less accurate and gave off a huge muzzle flash when used, blinding the gunners at night and giving away its position. Despite this, it was very successful, being able to penetrate the vast majority of German tanks from the front and being developed into the 77mm HV gun as used in the Cromet. Still a 76.2mm gun, but it used different ammunition, so the name was changed to prevent confusion. This upgrade shortened the gun to make it fit better inside a tank's turrets, as before this it had to use specially designed vehicles such as the Archer or the heavily modified Sherman turrets to get it to fit. It was replaced after the war by more powerful guns, such as the 84.6mm 20-pounder or the very famous 105mm L7 gun, which was on pretty much every NATO tank during the Cold War. The final weapon commonly used was the QF 75mm. This was an attempt to provide a general-purpose gun similar to that used on the American tanks such as the Sherman. This was a heavily modified 6-pounder with a wider barrel and a slightly modified breech. It was created as British tanks packed an effective high-explosive round, as the 6-pounder HE round was nowhere near as effective as the 75mm guns on the American M3 and M4 tanks. Coincidentally, the 75mm round was an almost perfect fit for the cartridge of the 6-pounder, and hence the new shell was invented. Whilst Vickers were attempting to create a high-velocity 75mm gun, it was much larger than existing guns and would have to be fitted into much larger turrets. The main advantage of the QF 75mm was that it was able to be fitted into any tank using a 6-pounder with no modification required. Its high explosive shell was effective, but it was less so when compared to the armour-piercing performance of the 6-pounder. For this reason, some units contain tanks with both 6-pounders and 75mm. Both of those guns could be fit to many different tanks, most famously things like the Cromwell or the Churchill. Those are all of the standard guns fitted to British tanks during the war. I haven't included any other guns that were designed more for infantry support, so no howitzers or anything like that. I may make another video covering them in the future if this one does well. Thank you very much for watching. See you in the next video. Goodbye.